Hi everyone, welcome back. In this video we're going to take a look at the scale constraint. Just like the orient constraint and the point constraint, in this case the constraint obviously is going to control the size of the object, the scale. So essentially what you've got is move or position, rotation and size or scale. So we'll pop the options open for that. As you can see, they're basically exactly the same as the previous ones. We've got a maintain value and we have an offset value when the maintain is off. Keep in mind with scale, the default is always 1. And the reason for that is if you've got 0 scale, it means you have 0 size, which means your object will shrink down to nothing. And you won't be able to see it. So the scale is always 1 by default. And then it's basically multiples of 1. So something that is twice the size of something else, like if we duplicate this cube, for instance, and then scale it up to 2, the new scaled object would be twice the size of the original one. Okay, so that's how the scale works. So yeah, just like the other constraints, we select the controlling object, we select the object to be controlled, and then basically what we do is we add the constraint. So I'll just apply that. Now, once again, over in the channel box, you can see that the scale now is highlighted just here with these blue icons. And if I take the master object and I rotate it, you can see there's no impact. If I reposition it, if I move it, nothing happens. But if I scale it, you'll see that the other object scales as well, like that. So keep in mind it's proportionate. So you know, if this object is 1/4 the size of this one, when this scales up, this is always going to remain 1/4 the size of this. Okay. Now, let's try something a little different. If I go into the actual constraint options just here, you can see I've got the weight. We talked about that in another video. Basically, this is like the on-off switch. And you can see when you click and drag inside the number, let me just pop out of that again. If I click and drag inside there, it's going to turn it on and off, right? But see how it jumps up like full numbers. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? Like that. It's still a bit fiddly. It doesn't work great. So obviously if we turn it off, it's off. 0 is off. 1 is on. But let's watch what happens if I change this to 2. So if I type 2 in there, and then I select this, and I scale this up, it doesn't necessarily look like it's doing it any quicker than if it was set to 1. So let's switch that back down to 1, and let's see what happens. Yeah, it looks the same. Potentially, depending on how you've got things set up, you could get this to actually scale up sort of exponentially, where it may scale up, instead of scaling up at the same rate, it might, there might be a way that we can set the connections up so that this actually, it scales twice as much as this one, for instance. I wasn't sure whether or not the weighting would do that, but there'd be a way of adjusting it. Now, if I select this controlled object and I duplicate it, and then I move this across, you can see I've got controlled 1. Okay, the reason it says 1 is because the original name doesn't have a number on it, so it's always going to start with 1. If I expand that out, it's given me another constraint. Okay, but you can see that these constraints are exactly the same name. Controlled scale constraint 1. Controlled scale constraint 1. Right? So they're both the same name. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually the same constraint. So to test that theory, if I change the name here to 2 and hit enter, you can see that it doesn't change the other one. Okay, so keep in mind that things technically could be named the same in here, but it doesn't mean that they're actually the same object or constraint. And they're not linked in any way, right? Now, let's see what happens when we connect two things together, right? I'm going to get rid of this second constraint. I'm going to get rid of that, right? What I want to do is add another constraint from this object, but this time onto the second controlled object, right? So I'm going to select the main object, the control. I'm going to select the controlled, and I'm going to add the exact same settings. So I'm going to add that on, right? So now what I've got is one object that constrains both, or two other objects, like that, right? I'm just going to move these a bit further apart, give them a bit more room. Now, once again, you know, movement, rotation does nothing to this because it's a scale based system. But you can see I can get them to do that, right? Now, if I, let's pop over into the attributes for a second on here. You can see that on the main control object, when we go into the attributes, we do actually have tabs for the two constraints. I've got one there, right? And then I've got another one there. Now note that these both, again, are called the same. Actually, they're not called the same thing. This one's controlled 1 because it takes the name of the object that's connecting to, and that says controlled 1. Right? This one, what I might do is rename this 0. I'll just put a 0 in there, like that. So now I can see this is controlled, let me just grab this. I've got controlled 1 scale constraint. Now this hasn't changed, just here. The name of the constraint, even though I've changed this name, it doesn't change this. So I'm going to pop in a 0 there as well. Okay, grab the main one, and now you can see those two there. So controlled 1 scale constraint 1, and controlled 0 scale constraint. So I can go into here, and I can actually see some of the settings for that constraint, just there. All right, same with that one. But what it's not showing me is the weight. That's what I really want. And so to get to that, basically I've got to select either the object that is constrained or the constraint object itself. Usually what I do is grab the actual object, because that's going to have the value on it. Okay, so if I pop over to here, right, I can see controlled 0 scale constraint 1, and that's the easiest way to get into those settings. Okay, if you're in the attribute editor, what you would need to do is sort of come down and actually look for potentially through some of these drop downs to find that weight value, because as you can see here, it doesn't have the weight values directly on there. That's actually the object. If I go into the controlled 0 option here, I've got rotate, scale, shear, but there's no weight in there. What we would have to do is potentially come down, and it might be down in here somewhere. It's been a while since I've looked at these, so you might find sometimes that they're, the weight values are sort of hidden. Okay. Over time you'll become more familiar with sort of what settings are sort of hidden away in these tabs, but in the attribute editor. But yeah, for your weights, generally speaking, this is the easiest way of getting to them. So what I'm going to do is grab this second cube, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change this control weight. Okay, and I'm going to try ramping it up to like 5, something quite high. And then what we're going to do is scale this and see if there's any difference between these two. As we saw before, you can see that it's not really changing anything. So basically, even though you can go higher with the weight value, going higher than 1 doesn't change anything at all. It's always going to scale in the same way by default. So having that at 5, even though you can go all the way up with it, it doesn't change anything, because basically it's an on-off. It's like it's 0 off, 1 on. Now, if I change this to 0.5, it'll accept the 0.5 value, but let's see if that actually changes it. No, it's still working as though it's on. So I would think even potentially, if we put this to 0.1, or even maybe over, or smaller than 0.1, so like 0.01, anything that's above a 0 will treat it as though the weight is on. So it's basically literally an on-off. If the value is higher than 0, even if it's like 0.00001, it would still treat it as though it's switched on, because it's not absolute 0. So I can pop that on there. Okay, so yeah, that's the scale constraint. You can sort of see how that functions. In the next video, we're going to take a look at the aim constraint. Once again, this is going to be a rotation-based constraint. So we'll leave this one here, and I'll see you in the next one.